finally, poor little orphaned Lightroom who, didn't get the tone curve in the masking panel for a long time when Camera Raw did, finally has it. And it's really cool. So the tone curve, I feel like a lot of people don't understand the power of it or what it is. So I'm just going to explain it a little bit. The tone curve builds contrast in the image, but unlike the contrast slider, it gives you a lot more detail. Let me just, in the regular develop module tone curve, this is not on the masking panel. Let me just show you a little bit about it. So if you look at the screen, you can see this diagonal line that goes right straight across this little tone curve square. The bottom left is black. That signifies black. The top right is white. Those two things line up just like the histogram do. So if I click anywhere on this line and drag down, you see I'm in the shadow area here. You can see the histogram moving up on top too, right? So as I drag this curve down in these shadow areas, I'm adding more dark pixels to the image. You can see that, right? And in addition, that line is getting steeper. And wherever the line is steeper means you've added contrast. Where the line flattens out from the initial diagonal, it means you're going to lose contrast. So a common develop module move is something called an S-curve. And that is that you bring the darks down and you bring the lights up just like this to add contrast. So you can see that if I bring this across so that it's straight up and down, I actually have the most contrast possible. Now it's a vertical line. That's like absolutely the most contrasty thing. And look at the histogram.
Yeah.
It's cray. So the good thing is though, you can, and I accidentally did that, don't want to do that, but you can really dial this in. So let's say you have an image and you want to have steep contrast in some areas and no contrast in the others. You can also change where the black point and the white point are. You can see the black point I'm bringing up so that it's gray. There's all this crazy stuff that you can do with it. It's fantastic. The other thing that you can do, and I'm just going to hit option, where is it? I'm just going to reset it up here. This little adjust turns into a reset button if you hold down option on a Mac or alt on a PC. You can also work in color on this. So if I grab the red dot up here, that gives me a curve that's red and cyan. It's kind of interest to underwater photographers, right? Because we're often dealing with an unwanted cyan color cast. And if you can really learn to manage this tone curve, you can very specifically say where you want less cyan, where you want less red, all that kind of stuff. So if I bring down the center point here, you'll see I'm adding green. If I bring it up, you see I'm adding red. Something else, it's got also green and magenta. That's your tint. So you can bring this down magenta and green. These are complementary colors, which means that they cancel each other out. So if you have too much green in your image, you're going to add magenta. Too much pink, you're going to add green. And the tone curve lets you do it in small tonal regions. Here, of course, is blue. Same thing. We have blue and yellow. Those are complementary. And if you didn't notice before, I'm just going to go back to the parametric curve here. So just go back to the point curve. Something you should know about curves also, and in general, is that when you darken an area, the color becomes more pronounced, more saturated. When you brighten an area, the color becomes less saturated. So this is something you should be thinking of in your editing all the time too. You people that are leaning on the black slider, you know who you are. You people that are leaning on dehaze, stop it. But what I would do is, if you are in a position, go back here and add some vivid colors. Let's just go here. Let's make that red. I really like that. Do something crazy. We'll add some pink to the edge of that. Oh, that's lovely. Come up here and we'll add some cool tones too. If you start moving these sliders or tone curves or whatever it is around so much that your colors are getting saturated, it makes your image look amateurish. It makes it look overworked. So what I recommend is in Lightroom, you don't have the same blending modes that you do in Photoshop where you can say just deal with the tone. just deal with the brightness and darkness. So what I would suggest that you do is if you get these deep colors going on, that you actually use the vibrant slider in the negative amount so that you're able to just bring down that saturation a little bit. Anyway, that's my rant on saturation for now. I'm going to just move on here. Okay, so there are other ways of creating contrast in your image. And we know that the basic panel actually has some sliders that kind of do the same thing. So what's really the difference? Well, the basic panel sliders control the calculations that operate on the raw data as it comes in. So you kind of want to front load your work using this top set of sliders here, using exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks, because they're smart. They are what Adobe calls parametrically linked, which means that they work differently depending upon what the settings they are cumulatively. The curves tool controls then the lightness and darkness of the results from those sliders that are working on the raw data. So it really is better if you're going to use the tone curve to do the basic panel stuff first, and then use the tone curve to really kind of fine tune and finesse. And that's also true when it's used on a mask, which I'll show you in a minute here. So in this image, for instance, I really like the atmospheric kind of grandiosity that, these giant animals in a huge ocean are there, but I would like to bring a little more contrast into that front humpback whale. Now, I already have the contrast almost all the way up. If you see the slider here, I've got it almost all the way up, and I can't really do much color correction because the temperature slider is all the way over to 0 already. So I don't have much control over the color. I could add, I could change this a little bit. I don't want to make the water purple, but I have a little control over color there. But if you look at the histogram, it's a sure sign that you're lacking contrast if you have space at the left-hand side of the histogram and space at the right-hand side. That means you've got a big gooey bunch of midtones. That's fantastic, but you need to spread them out to get a little more dynamic range. And I really can't. I've got the contrast all the way up here. I guess I could bring blacks down, but that does something really weird. And it starts also, again, shifting the color. The front of that whale starts getting really dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to the masking panel. This little icon up here at the top of these local tools is the new masking panel. And we've got a lot of stuff online about that. We've got new masking magic. Zero to Hero covers this in depth. I'm not going to go into it because it's a whole other ball of wax. It's fantastic. But what I want to do now is I want to select this whale, and probably it's not going to be easy for Lightroom to figure out the subject. So I'm going to have to do a little extra work to get it going. If I click subject here, Lightroom only picks up part of the whale because indeed there's no contrast in the tail. And what I really want to do is also pick up that tail so that I can deal with the contrast here. It's this, I zoom in here, you can see this is picking up part that I don't want. So right now I can just subtract that with a brush. I'm just going to come in here and erase that away. And I'm going to be really sloppy because I don't want to take too much time with this. But wherever that red is not, the image is not going to be affected. Wherever the red is, the mask is, you are going to be able to add changes to the image. And I would just go around the edge here and make sure that there's no artifacting, but I'm not going to go crazy with it. Just make sure you look at your image at 100% and look at the edges of these seemingly miraculous masks, because sometimes you can see, you see this? That's not exactly a perfect line, okay? So you wind up having to do a little touch up or to use different tools. Just keep an eye on it. This is 1600%. That's ridiculous magnification to show you, but it's just, something to keep in mind while you're working. Now, I want to grab the tail of this whale too, and subject didn't do it. So I'm going to actually try something called object. I'm going to click the add button. because I'm adding to a current mask, and I'm going to get objects. And then objects has two modes. One is this rectangle that I can just draw out if I wanted to, and one is a paintbrush. Because there's so little contrast, I'm going to do everything I can to be specific and tell Lightroom where I want this effect to happen. So I'm just going to click and drag over this tail. Okay, not too bad. I'm going to add a little bit more here. Actually, I think I might just add a brush. So I'll click the add with a brush. And now I'll make the brush a little smaller. I'm just hitting left bracket to do that. And I'll paint that in. Okay, we're going to call that good for now. Ooh, there's a little bit down here I want to add to, I see. And maybe a little bit over here. All right. We've got the whale selected. So now, if I come down here, I have curves that I can now add to this selection, which is great because although I had contrast before, I had clarity, I had texture, all these things that add contrast, they don't give me the granular control that the tool, the tone curve does. So now what am I going to do? Let's just start with a regular S curve. So the minute you click on any effect, the red goes away so you can see what you're doing. And I'm just going to drag this down a little bit. Now, it does make it look really hokey and artificial in the back there, but that's because I haven't added the top of the S curve yet. So I'm going to come up here and start dialing that in. And you can see the texture on the whale is really changing. And I'm able to just move this around and visually make this much more specific. Now, I might actually make a little bit darker here. I'm bringing down more in the shadows, and that shifts the curve. And I'm looking at the histogram a little bit while I do this. Now I can see that that's also getting pretty blue. Remember when you darken colors, it gets a little more saturated. Yep. So I can jump over here to the blue tab and I can say, you know what, I think I just want to make it a tiny bit less blue. So you can see, I'm going to exaggerate so you can see what this is doing. I can shift the color right from within the tone curve. And right now I just have the midtones, but if I wanted to highlight the highlights or the shadows, I could do that too. So that's why this tool is so absolutely fantastic. Now, if you don't know what part of the image, where these, points on the curve are coming from, this has a targeted adjustment tool. It's this little tiny circle over here. If I click on it, it lights up. When you put that in the image, you have a hands-on, very intuitive way of saying, hey, I want this tone to be darker. You just click and drag down, and it's going to grab a tone. And then if I wanted to, I could add other things to this. I still think that's looking a little too blue, though, so I'm going to bring this down. Yeah, that's a little better. Now I'm going to add just a tiny bit more dark to it. That's all fine and dandy. This area of the whale's face is like a little bit too dark now. So I'm going to erase this mask with a very gradual way of doing it. Instead of with a brush, I'm going to get this math and say subtract with a linear gradient. And that way I can just come in and really gradually, you can see.
Oh yeah, nice.
Take away that. So it blends perfectly. It looks really natural once you do it. So I'm able to add contrast in a very specific way to just a mask in Lightroom, and it's I love it. Finally.
Yeah, very powerful feature that was missing from Lightroom 11 when they added it to Adobe Camera Raw.
Here's another example of how this would work. It's really hard because the foreground subject is very dark, the background is bright, and I want to deal with different parts of the tonal areas on the fish differently. I can do one slider to make it brighter or one slider to make it darker, but there is no slider that simultaneously makes part of it brighter and part of it darker except contrast. And as you know, this is just, it's kind of a heavy hammer because it also affects everything in the background. And when I'm looking at what happens to the fish, you see the colors start to get really saturated as I'm doing that. So I think instead what I'm going to do is get a mask here. I'm going to say select the subject, the artificial intelligence decides what the subject is. And in this case, it does a great job.
Yep.
And so now I'm going to come down here to the tone curve, and I can see where all the data is in this part of the mask. It's too dark. So what I'm going to do is lift right here, kind of at the edge of the histogram up here. I'm going to lift that. Okay. And so I'm able to kind of get rid of that area. And then if I wanted to just pop that eye a little darker, I'd go way down to the bottom and just pick up the darkest parts of that fish. I could, protect these highlights in here so they don't blow out by putting another dot there to kind of lock that down. Okay, I'm going to do this, maybe bring this up a little bit more, maybe bring these highlights down a little bit. All right, that's cool. I think that looks great. And as an extra added bonus, I can click on these little dots next to the mask and say duplicate and invert. So now not only do I have the subject, I have the entire background that I can use with a mask. So I can start bringing this down. Let's see, I want to make that kelp a little darker over there in the corner. So I'm going to go to the shadows and I'm going to bring this up.
Yeah, super powerful,
great, really powerful,
super powerful, and a lot more focused. It's just,
and then this front here is maybe a little too warm. So what I'm going to do is go to the blue channel here, and it's pretty hot. It's actually a mix, but it's the lighter parts that I'm seeing this kind of yellowy orange on. So I'm going to just put a dot in the midtones to kind of lock that down, and a dot in the shadows to kind of lock that down. And then I can come up here and play around with these highlights. You can see how I can just take those yellow tones and kind of change it so that they're a little cooler.
Yeah, wow.
And then when I see the before and after, I've totally relit the image. Again, if it seems like the colors are getting, too wacky, I would go back down to the basic panel and just take vibrance down a little tiny bit to make it look more natural. I know people hate to slide the vibrance or saturation in the other way. Trust me. It's really great. And this was shot with an old camera, the Nikon 200.
Okay.
So this is a low resolution image that still holds up really well with these tools. It's absolutely great.